July the 2nd, 1944. The air was sharp with sunlight as a woman in a white medical coat stepped out of the darkness of an underground cave near Cherbourg, France. Her name was Dr. Schwester. For days, she had lived in the shadows, treating the wounded by candlelight, boiling and reusing bandages, whispering to her fellow nurses that American medicine was nothing more than propaganda. She raised her hands in surrender, blinking against the daylight she had not seen in a week. Behind her, 8 other German nurses followed, walking slowly, eyes hollow from exhaustion. They expected hostility. They expected humiliation. Instead, what they would see in the coming hours would shatter everything they believed about war, about medicine, and about truth itself. The story of these 9 nurses was not an isolated tale. It was part of a much larger journey that stretched across continents, from the burning deserts of Tunisia in 1943 to the quiet hospitals of America in 1945. These women, trained under the Nazi system to believe that medicine existed to serve ideology and race, would be forced to confront a new reality. In their world, resources had always been scarce. Morphine was rationed to the last drop. Bandages were boiled and reused until they fell apart. Antibiotics were almost unheard of. They had been told that America was weak, wasteful, and decadent, a nation that could never match the strength of German science. But within hours of their capture, those beliefs began to crumble. They saw surgical rooms with electric lights instead of flickering candles. They saw blood plasma stored safely for weeks, not risky transfusions from one soldier to another. They saw penicillin, a drug they had heard only in whispers, used freely to heal wounds that in Germany would have meant certain death. Colonel Richard P. Johnson, the American officer who received them at the 45th Evacuation Hospital, did not look at them as enemies. He looked at them as nurses, as healers, as human beings bound by the same duty to save life. Within days, they would be returned under Geneva Convention rules, but the short time they spent in American hands would mark them forever. This was not just the capture of enemy nurses, it was the beginning of an ideological collapse, a collapse that started with medicine but ended with a profound understanding: healing must serve humanity, never ideology. May the 13th, 1943. The desert heat in Tunisia was merciless, burning the skin and choking the lungs. German soldiers, exhausted and starving, marched with their hands raised as white flags fluttered weakly in the dry wind. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, the commander of the Afrika Korps, had surrendered. What followed was one of the largest capitulations of the Second World War. Between 250,000 and 275,000 Axis troops laid down their arms. Among them were not only infantry and officers, but also doctors, orderlies, and German Red Cross nurses, known as the DRK Schwestern. For 2 years, these nurses had endured the unrelenting desert war. They had served beside Rommel's Afrika Korps, tending to soldiers who returned from the front lines burned by the sun, riddled with infection, and shattered by artillery. Supplies were scarce. They rationed morphine grain by grain. They reused dressings until the cloth was threadbare. Candlelight, not electric lamps, guided their hands during surgery. They were told that Germany's sacrifices proved its strength. They were told that America was soft, incapable of withstanding real hardship. Among those captured were 2 decorated nurses, Ilse Schultz and Greta Falk. Both had received the Iron Cross Second Class in April 1943, an honor bestowed on fewer than 20 women throughout the war. Their medals were symbols of loyalty, of endurance, and of service to the Nazi state. But in the days ahead, those medals would weigh heavily on their conscience, reminders of an ideology that was about to unravel. The surrender in Tunisia was more than a military defeat. It was a revelation. As German medical staff were gathered at collection points in Tunis, they were met not with cruelty, but with remarkable efficiency. American officers followed the Geneva Convention with precision. Nurses and doctors were sorted within hours. Those still needed to tend to German wounded were retained. Others were processed for evacuation. Every captured nurse received a medical examination, not a beating. Dental infections were treated, malnutrition was addressed, and those who needed eyeglasses were given them. For Schultz and Falk, The shock was profound. They had been told that Americans were disorganized, careless, indifferent to human suffering. Yet, here, in the dusty streets of Tunis, they saw American physicians bending over German prisoners, offering treatments that many civilians in their homeland could not even obtain. Within weeks, groups of captured German nurses were boarding Liberty ships bound for the United States. These vessels, mass-produced in numbers that defied belief, were themselves a kind of weapon. Each ship was a floating contradiction to Nazi propaganda. They carried not only prisoners, but also a vision of America's industrial power. On board, German nurses witnessed something they had never seen in their own army: fully equipped medical facilities. The operating theaters on these ships gleamed with electric light, uninterrupted by power shortages. X-ray machines hummed steadily. Refrigerated storage kept medicines cool, while German hospitals struggled even to maintain basic supplies. Most striking of all were the blood plasma units, properly typed, stored, and ready for use. In German field hospitals, transfusions often meant clumsy and dangerous direct transfers between soldiers, a gamble that could just as easily kill as save. Here, the Americans had turned blood itself into a weapon of survival, abundant and safe. Even meals on board told a story. German nurses, accustomed to scraping crumbs from plates and saving bones for broth, watched American medics discard half-eaten portions. To them, it was unthinkable waste. To the Americans, it was simply abundance. Schultz later wrote in her notes, preserved in German archives, "The Americans throw away more medical supplies in a day than we received in a month. They have medicines we have only heard about." As the Liberty ships crossed the Atlantic, day after day reinforced the same truth. America had resources beyond measure. Every discarded bandage, every ration of sulfur powder sprinkled liberally instead of hoarded, was another blow to the carefully built myth of German superiority. And yet, perhaps the most unsettling revelation was not the supplies, but the spirit behind them. The Americans shared knowledge freely. They allowed German nurses to observe procedures, to ask questions, even to assist. For women taught that medicine served ideology, not humanity, this openness was incomprehensible. They began to see that American medicine was not merely about winning battles. It was about preserving life itself without distinction of uniform or flag. By June 1943, the first groups of German medical personnel arrived in the United States. They were taken to ports from Norfolk to New York. For many, it was their first glimpse of America, a nation they had been taught to despise. Instead of poverty and weakness, they saw towering hospitals lit against the night sky. In Richmond, the Medical College of Virginia rose above the streets. In Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Hospital stood as a monument to healing. From the windows of their trains, they saw one city after another, each with medical facilities more advanced than what most Germans had ever known. The journey that began in the deserts of North Africa was not just a passage into captivity. It was the beginning of a transformation. For the nurses like Schultz and Falk, every step brought them further from the world they thought they knew. They had been raised to believe that medicine was a tool of racial purity, that scarcity proved strength, that compassion toward enemies was weakness. But now, the evidence before their eyes was undeniable. America's power was not only in its weapons, it was in its hospitals, its laboratories, its belief that healing was universal. The unraveling of Nazi ideology had begun, not on the battlefield, but in the wards of American medicine. As the trains rolled deeper into the American heartland, the German nurses sat in silence, staring through the windows at a country they had been told was broken and weak. Instead, they saw abundance everywhere, fields heavy with crops, factories belching smoke not from desperation, but from unstoppable production. At one stop in Washington, D.C., Red Cross volunteers climbed aboard, handing out small packages, cigarettes, chocolate, soap, even writing paper. Schultz could not comprehend it. How could the enemy show such kindness to those who had been taught to hate them? Every mile of track, every station, every glimpse of American hospitals standing proud in the distance chipped away at the fortress of belief that had been built inside them. They were prisoners, yes, but more than that, They were witnesses. Witnesses to a reality that Germany had denied, witnesses to a truth too powerful to ignore. By the time the trains reached the sprawling prisoner of war camps, the seeds had been planted. What began in the desert heat of Tunisia was now a quiet but unstoppable transformation. For the German nurses, captivity would not only confine them, it would open their eyes. When the train stopped at Opelika, Alabama, the air was heavy with summer heat. Yet the first thing the German nurses noticed was not the climate. It was the camp hospital. Behind barbed wire and guarded towers stood buildings with windows glowing at night, filled with equipment that many of them had only studied in textbooks. Camp Opelika, September 1942. Though designed as a prisoner of war camp, its medical facilities reflected a standard of care that astounded its German occupants. For the first time, nurses like Ilse Schultz and Greta Falk were asked to work side by side with American doctors. The Geneva Convention required that captured medical personnel continue their duties, and the Americans took this literally. German nurses were given responsibilities, treating fellow prisoners under the supervision of American medical officers. Inside the operating theaters, the light did not flicker with the dim glow of candles. Instead, it poured down from adjustable surgical lamps, bright, clean, and constant. Autoclaves sterilized surgical tools in minutes, not hours. Electric cauterization replaced the crude methods they had known. Where German field medics struggled with shortages, the Americans had abundance. The pharmacy shelves stunned them most. Dozens upon dozens of medications, neatly labeled, stored in climate-controlled rooms, expiration dates stretching years into the future. Morphine was not counted drop by drop. Sulfur powder, once rationed like gold dust in the Afrika Korps, was used liberally. Bandages were discarded after a single use instead of being boiled again and again. Schultz whispered to Falk one evening, "This is not medicine as we were taught it. This is another world." But perhaps the most powerful revelation came with the discovery of penicillin. In 1943, the United States produced 21 billion units of this new drug. By 1945, production would soar to over 6 trillion units. For German nurses accustomed to losing patients to infection, the sight was miraculous. A wound that would have festered and killed under their care now healed in days. Limbs that would have been amputated in German hospitals were saved by a few injections. Schultz and Falk saw infections vanish, soldiers rise from beds that would have been deathbeds back home. To them, it seemed almost supernatural. At Glennon General Hospital in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, the transformation went further. This facility, with nearly 1,700 beds, was staffed by parallel teams, American and German. Colonel Henry W. Mish believed in something revolutionary: integrated care. He allowed German nurses to participate directly, sharing knowledge across enemy lines. They were no longer outsiders, they were colleagues in medicine. And yet, the greatest shock came not from penicillin or plasma, but from the presence of African American nurses. Under the rules of segregation, black nurses were often assigned to treat German prisoners rather than white American soldiers. To the German women, indoctrinated in Nazi racial ideology, it was an unthinkable humiliation. Yet what they witnessed was even more destabilizing. These black professionals were competent, skilled, and often their supervisors. Lieutenant Eleanor Powell, an African-American nurse at Camp Florence in Arizona, corrected their techniques with calm authority. She taught them procedures, oversaw their patient care, and expected their respect. The Nazi education that had declared non-white peoples inferior now collapsed before their eyes. The contradiction was undeniable. The women they had been taught to despise possessed greater knowledge and authority in the hospital than they did. Meanwhile, at Camp Forest in Tennessee, the miracles of American medicine unfolded daily. German nurses watched patients who would have been amputees under their hands walk again within weeks. They saw soldiers near death recover, as if time itself had reversed. Plasma banks, refrigeration systems, and cross-matching techniques ensured that transfusions were safe. In Germany, such procedures often killed more than they saved. Here, they were routine, efficient, and life-saving. The psychological weight grew heavier. For every operation, every bottle of penicillin, every transfusion, the nurses saw the proof that their ideology was false. American medicine was not weak. It was powerful, scientific, and most importantly, it was rooted in compassion. Enemies were treated the same as allies. German prisoners received the same scarce medications and the same careful nursing as wounded American soldiers. Christmas of 1943 brought another shock, this time not technological, but moral. 500,000 packages arrived at camps across America for German prisoners. Each contained soap, cigarettes, chocolate, and writing supplies. Local churches sang German carols. Boy Scouts delivered handmade cards. Families with sons fighting in Europe sent gifts to the very men their children were fighting against. Schultz later wrote in disbelief, "The enemy shows us Christian charity, while our own government teaches only hatred." These experiences cut deeply. The German nurses had been raised to believe that compassion was weakness, that medicine was a tool for strengthening the race. But here, across the ocean, the enemy used medicine as a bridge, as a proof of humanity, as a declaration that healing knew no borders. And the Americans did not stop at showing abundance. They opened their books. They allowed the German nurses to attend lectures, to study medical ethics, to read scientific journals. At the University of Nebraska Medical School, at Fort Robinson, German prisoners sat in classrooms where the scientific method was explained as a universal truth, not a political weapon. They learned that many of the advances Germany had once claimed proudly had been the work of Jewish scientists expelled by the Nazi regime. It was a truth almost too painful to bear. In their quiet bunks at night, Schultz and Falk and the others whispered to each other. They were prisoners, yes, but more than that, they were witnesses. Witnesses to a medicine that was not bound by ideology. Witnesses to a compassion that tore apart every lie they had been told. What had begun in Tunisia as surrender was now something much greater. It was not just captivity. It was conversion. The unraveling of ideology did not come all at once. It came in moments, small, piercing experiences that struck deeper than any battlefield defeat. The first of these moments arrived during Christmas of 1943. In Germany, the holiday had become hollow, stripped of warmth by shortages and propaganda. Families gathered around empty tables, candles burned in cold homes while bombs rained on cities. But in the prisoner of war camps of America, the German nurses witnessed something they could hardly believe. 500,000 packages arrived, carefully wrapped and distributed. Each contained small luxuries: soap, cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, even homemade cookies. Churches sang German carols for men they had been told were monsters. Boy Scouts delivered cards written in careful, childish handwriting. "Merry Christmas, even if you are far from home." Some packages came from American families whose sons were fighting in Europe, yet they still sent gifts to the enemy. Greta Falk later recorded her shock. "We were told Americans were selfish, greedy, incapable of sacrifice. Yet here, they gave to their enemies. They shared joy with us when our own government taught only bitterness." The contradiction gnawed at her. For years she had worn her Iron Cross with pride. Now it felt like a weight of shame. Then came the lectures and educational programs organized by the Special Projects Division of the American War Department. German nurses sat in classrooms at institutions like the University of Nebraska Medical School. There, they learned concepts alien to their training: patient rights, medical ethics, the scientific method as a universal principle. The method of teaching itself was a shock. In Nazi Germany, lectures were commands, questions were discouraged, doubt was treason. In America, instructors encouraged disagreement. Students debated, argued, challenged assumptions. To the German women, it was as if a window had opened in a dark room. But the most devastating revelation came when they opened American medical journals. Page after page bore names they recognized, names of German scientists who had fled their homeland after being expelled by Nazi racial laws. Jewish doctors and researchers, stripped of citizenship, had continued their work in the United States and Britain. It was their discoveries, penicillin production methods, blood storage techniques, advances in epidemiology that now saved lives in American hospitals. The German nurses were forced to confront a terrible truth. Their homeland had cast out its greatest minds, branding them inferior, while the enemy embraced them and turned their brilliance into salvation. Schultz wrote in her diary, "We thought we were the guardians of science, but we were its betrayers. We chose ideology over truth, and it made us blind." This confrontation deepened in the spring of 1945, when liberation footage from concentration camps was shown to German prisoners. At first, denial was instinctive. Propaganda had prepared them to believe such images were lies. But then came testimonies from American doctors who had entered the camps, photographs beyond dispute, letters from relatives back home confirming the horrors. The women who had been taught that medicine existed to eliminate the weak were forced to face what that doctrine meant in practice. Medicine had been twisted into an instrument of death. The guilt was suffocating. Some wept openly in the barracks, others sat in silence for days. The question pressed upon them, had they, by serving the regime, become accomplices to its crimes? American officers did not wield this revelation as a weapon of humiliation. Instead, they approached it as a lesson. Courses in denazification and medical ethics became mandatory. Case studies were presented, how racial medicine harmed patients, how scientific neutrality saved them. Lieutenant Colonel Dorothy Whitman, one of the American nurses overseeing German staff, emphasized documentation and patient advocacy. "Technical skill is nothing without ethics," she told them. "A doctor or nurse without conscience is more dangerous than any weapon." The professional role of nurses itself shifted in their eyes. Under the Nazi model, they had been subordinates, silent, unquestioning. In the American system, nurses were thinkers, advocates, professionals with autonomy. They could challenge a doctor's order, propose alternatives, and act independently within their scope. This empowerment was as revolutionary as penicillin. Captain Helen Morrison explained it clearly. "You are responsible for patient outcomes. If something is wrong, speak up, no matter who gave the order." For the German nurses, this was a revelation. It meant medicine was not about obedience to authority. It was about responsibility to the patient. Healing became a moral act, not an ideological command. The deepest wound to their indoctrination, however, came from working under African American medical personnel. Segregation in the United States assigned black nurses to prisoner of war wards, an injustice in its own right. Yet even within this flawed system, these professionals demonstrated knowledge, skill, and authority that directly contradicted Nazi racial ideology. Lieutenant Eleanor Powell, the African-American nurse who trained German staff at Camp Florence, corrected their techniques, guided their practice, and supervised their care. To women who had been taught that race determined worth, the experience was disorienting. But as weeks turned to months, respect replaced prejudice. The lie they had been raised on could not survive the truth they saw daily. By the time the war drew to its bloody end in Europe, the German nurses had changed. They no longer looked at medicine as a tool of ideology. They had witnessed its true purpose, science and compassion united for healing. They had walked through a door that could never be closed again. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. Cities lay in ruins, families scattered, and hospitals overwhelmed with the wounded and the sick. For the German nurses held in American camps, the end of the conflict did not mean an end to their journey. It meant the beginning of something even greater, preparation for return. The American authorities understood that a shattered Germany would face not only hunger and devastation, but also epidemics, malnutrition, and the collapse of its medical infrastructure. Hospitals were destroyed. Pharmacies were empty. Public health was a memory. If the German people were to survive, they would need trained professionals, nurses, doctors, and orderlies, ready to rebuild from nothing. And so, in camps across the United States, a new chapter began. German nurses were enrolled in courses on public health, epidemic control, and emergency medicine. They learned how to purify water with minimal resources, how to organize vaccination campaigns, how to establish clinics in towns where no building still stood. They practiced treating malnutrition, using simple yet effective methods to restore strength to starving children. Colonel Richard Stevens, who oversaw much of this training, spoke to them plainly. "You are returning to a nation that will have massive medical needs. This knowledge is our investment in a democratic Germany." His words echoed in the halls where captured nurses sat with notebooks in hand, realizing that even as prisoners, they were being entrusted with the future of their homeland. The courses were not limited to technical skill. They carried a deeper lesson. The American instructors emphasized again and again that medicine must serve all, not just the chosen few. They showed case studies from American hospitals where enemy prisoners and Allied soldiers received identical care. They reminded the German women of what they had seen firsthand: African American nurses caring for them with professionalism, American doctors treating prisoners with dignity, communities sending gifts to those once called enemies. The transformation was not easy. Many wrestled with guilt, struggling to reconcile their past service under Nazi authority with their new understanding of medicine. Some resisted at first, clinging to fragments of ideology. But the weight of evidence, the surgeries they had witnessed, the patients saved by penicillin, the lectures on ethics, proved stronger than the propaganda that had shaped their youth. Slowly, inevitably, their resistance crumbled. By late 1945 and into 1946, German nurses began to return home. Each carried with them not only the memory of captivity, but also certificates of training provided by American medical officers. These papers documented skills in epidemic control, hospital management, and public health. In the rubble of post-war Germany, they would become priceless. The reality they faced upon returning was staggering. 60% of German hospitals lay in ruins. Supplies were nearly non-existent. Families were starving. Diseases spreading rapidly in the crowded ruins of cities. Yet the returning nurses brought something more valuable than bandages or medicine. They brought a new philosophy. They opened nursing schools that emphasized patient advocacy, scientific rigor, and compassion. They introduced the concept of continuous education, training others not to obey blindly, but to think critically. They established blood banks modeled on the American system, saving lives with safe transfusions. They insisted on the systematic use of antibiotics, even when scarce, because they had seen how many lives could be spared. In these efforts, the lessons of captivity lived on. Schultz, Falk, and their fellow nurses became leaders in rebuilding German healthcare, passing on what they had witnessed to countless others. Every nurse they trained carried the legacy forward. Every hospital reorganized along American lines multiplied the effect. The transformation was so profound that by 1950, many German nursing schools were run by former prisoners of war. Their philosophy was clear. Never again would medicine be an instrument of ideology. Never again would patients be judged by race, nationality, or political value. Medicine, they taught, must serve humanity first. What began in the shadows of a Tunisian battlefield and in the wards of American prisoner camps now flowed into the lifeblood of a nation rising from ashes. These women, once servants of a regime that perverted medicine into cruelty, had become witnesses to its redemption. They had seen the worst of war, and they had discovered the best of healing. For them, captivity was not defeat, it was conversion. It was the passage from darkness into light, from ideology into truth, from obedience into compassion. And through their hands, Germany's post-war medicine was reborn, not as an instrument of power, but as a promise of humanity. By the summer of 1945, the war had ended, but the echoes of its lessons had only begun. For the German nurses who had once walked into captivity believing in the superiority of their homeland, the journey had remade them. They had seen abundance where they were taught to expect weakness. They had witnessed compassion where they were taught to expect hatred. And they had discovered that medicine, when freed from ideology, became the most powerful weapon of all, a weapon of healing. Years later, in 1995, a group of these surviving nurses gathered to write a statement for future generations. Their words carried the weight of history. We served the Nazi regime and became American prisoners. We witnessed that medicine corrupted by ideology becomes death's instrument, while medicine based on science and compassion serves life. Americans showed us abundance beyond imagination. More importantly, they demonstrated medicine without hatred. They treated enemies as patients deserving equal care. We returned, carrying more than medical knowledge. We brought understanding that healing transcends nationality and ideology. That testimony stood as a declaration of transformation. It reminded the world that even the most indoctrinated minds could change when faced with undeniable truth. These women had been shaped by propaganda, molded to serve a regime that placed race above humanity. Yet in the wards of American hospitals, they saw another path. A path where every patient, regardless of uniform or flag, was treated with equal dignity. The scale of this conversion was remarkable. Over 370,000 German prisoners of war were held in the United States. More than 200 medical facilities employed German staff. Tens of thousands of hours of medical education were documented, and hundreds of thousands of procedures were performed. At least 15 nursing schools in post-war Germany were established by former prisoners who carried American lessons back across the Atlantic. Hospitals in the U.S. zone of occupation were reorganized along American models, and within just a few years, German healthcare had been rebuilt on foundations of science and universal care. Each trained nurse influenced dozens of colleagues. Each reformed hospital treated thousands of patients. The ripple effects multiplied across cities and villages. What began as the capture of a handful of women in Tunisia and Cherbourg became a quiet revolution that reshaped an entire nation's medical philosophy. For the American doctors and nurses, this victory was not measured in battles won or cities taken. It was measured in lives saved, in minds changed, in compassion extended even to the enemy. It was, in truth, one of the greatest victories of the United States in World War II. Victory not of destruction, but of transformation. And yet, the story is not only about history. It carries a message for us today. In every age, there are those who would twist science to serve ideology, who would turn healing into harm, who would place hatred above humanity. The lesson of these nurses reminds us that such corruption can never endure. Truth, science, and compassion will always prevail. Medicine is not a tool of the state. It is not a servant of race, politics, or power. It is a promise that every life matters, that every wound deserves care, that healing belongs to all. That promise is what the German nurses discovered in captivity. That promise is what they carried back to rebuild their homeland. As we reflect on their journey, we must remember that history's greatest victories are not always won on the battlefield. Sometimes they are won in the quiet act of a nurse bandaging the wounds of an enemy. Sometimes they are won when compassion refuses to bow to hatred. Sometimes they are won when the simple act of healing becomes a defiance of ideology. The 9 women who stepped into the sunlight outside Cherbourg on July 2, 1944, could not have known what awaited them. They entered captivity as servants of a system built on cruelty. They left as witnesses to medicine's true purpose. Their journey tells us something vital, that healing is stronger than hate, that science is stronger than lies, and that humanity is stronger than any ideology. World War II scarred the world with destruction, but it also revealed the power of compassion. World War II showed that even in the darkest times, acts of healing could light the way forward. And World War II proved for all generations to come that medicine based on science and compassion is stronger than medicine corrupted by ideology. Their story is our inheritance, a reminder that the true purpose of medicine, of science, of humanity itself, is to heal without borders, to practice compassion without prejudice, and to defend life against the darkness of hatred. That is the victory that endures.